Guantanamo Bay, the psychology of indefinite detention. Imagine waking up every morning with one question that has no answer. Will I ever leave this place? No trial. No sentence. No finish line. Just time, stretching endlessly in every direction. At Guantanamo Bay, this isn't a dramatic metaphor. For hundreds of men held since 2002, it became their daily reality. And psychologists say uncertainty, not torture, not isolation, not the facility itself, is the most devastating force inside this controversial detention camp. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on a system built on legal limbo and explore how the human mind responds when the future is erased. Guantanamo Bay Detention Camp, located on a U.S. naval base in Cuba, opened in 2002 as part of the post-9/11 War on Terror. According to publicly available Defense Department records, more than 780 detainees have been held here, most without formal charges. Organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross, Human Rights Watch, and the Center for Constitutional Rights have repeatedly warned, indefinite detention creates severe psychological consequences, even for people without prior mental illness. What happens to a mind trapped in uncertainty for years? How does the absence of a release date change a person's sense of identity, stability, and hope? This documentary goes inside that psychological battleground, exploring real, documented experiences from detainees, military personnel, legal observers, and human rights investigators. No fiction. No exaggeration. Just the truth about what indefinite detention does to the human mind. Inside Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay doesn't look like the stereotype many imagine. There are no crumbling stone walls, no dim torchlit corridors. Instead, it is a high-security military installation, built in phases, redesigned repeatedly, and constantly surveilled. But beneath the fences and steel mesh is something deeper, an atmosphere shaped by uncertainty, not architecture. Former guards interviewed by human rights monitors described the same first impression: silence. Not the peaceful kind, but a tense, suspended quiet, like the air itself is waiting for something that never happens. Inside the housing units, the structure is clinical. Bright lights, clean lines, controlled movement. But even in these sanitized environments, the emotional weight is unmistakable. A former detainee once told the International Committee of the Red Cross that Guantanamo felt like a place where clocks stop but days keep passing. Many detainees arrived after long periods of CIA or military custody. They entered Guantanamo disoriented, exhausted, and unsure what awaited them. Some expected charges. Some expected trials. None were prepared for the reality: you may be here indefinitely, and no one can tell you for how long. Some units allowed controlled recreation or reading materials. Others enforced stricter conditions. But across the facility, one rule dominated daily life. The schedule controlled everything, while the future controlled nothing. Meals, medical checks, prayer times, exercise rotations, these created the illusion of structure. Yet beneath the routine was the constant psychological strain of not knowing what tomorrow would bring. A psychiatrist who evaluated detainees for the Red Cross explained it this way: predictability is the foundation of mental stability. Remove it, and even the strongest minds begin to fracture. Inside Guantanamo, predictability was the one thing no one had. History of the detention camp. Guantanamo Bay didn't begin as a symbol of indefinite detention. Its story starts more than a century earlier. The United States has controlled the naval base at Guantanamo Bay since 1903, after leasing the land from Cuba under an agreement that has remained controversial ever since. For decades, the base served as a logistical hub, remote, heavily guarded, and outside the borders of the U.S. legal system. Those qualities would later make it the center of a global debate. Everything changed after September 11, 2001. As the U.S. launched the War on Terror, officials searched for a location to hold individuals captured during operations in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Guantanamo Bay, sitting outside the U.S. mainland yet under American military control, became the chosen site. In January 2002, the first group of detainees arrived, shackled, hooded, and transported thousands of miles to what the government called a necessary facility for national security. The early years were marked by makeshift outdoor cages, later replaced by more permanent structures as the population grew. At its peak, Guantanamo held over 700 people at once, according to the Department of Defense. Most were classified as enemy combatants, a designation that placed them in a unique legal category. Not traditional prisoners of war, and not criminal defendants. This distinction formed the foundation of Guantanamo's most controversial feature, detention without trial. Legal challenges soon followed. Courts weighed whether detainees had rights to habeas corpus, whether the Constitution applied at Guantanamo, and whether military commissions could replace civilian courts. Each ruling shifted the landscape, yet the core reality remained. Many detainees were held for years with no formal charges. Human rights groups documented growing concerns. Reports from organizations like Human Rights Watch and the Center for Constitutional Rights described a system struggling with transparency, accountability, and mental health fallout. By the late 2000s, the world knew Guantanamo not as a simple detention facility but as a symbol of legal gray zones, international tension, and unresolved questions about justice and security. The history of the camp is not just about policies. It's about the slow, cumulative creation of a place where certainty disappeared. The psychology of indefinite detention. Psychologists who studied Guantanamo agree on one thing. The human mind is not built for uncertainty on this scale. Indefinite detention creates a unique psychological environment. Neither imprisonment nor freedom, neither trial nor acquittal. It becomes a space where the brain cannot form expectations, and without expectations, mental stability slowly erodes. A psychiatrist who spent years evaluating detainees for the International Committee of the Red Cross described the condition simply. The lack of an endpoint becomes its own form of trauma. Most prisons, no matter how harsh, provide a structure the mind can adapt to. There is a sentence, a timeline, a release date. Guantanamo removed that anchor. 1. Loss of temporal control. Studies referenced by human rights groups show that detainees often lost their sense of time. Days blended together, not because of monotony alone, but because the future itself was undefined. The brain relies on temporal landmarks to stay grounded, goals, seasons, milestones. Without them, orientation weakens. Some detainees told Red Cross observers they stopped counting days entirely because counting meant nothing. 2. Identity under pressure. Indefinite detention places enormous strain on identity. Without charges or a verdict, detainees existed in a state of accusation and ambiguity. They were neither convicted nor cleared, which created a psychological limbo. Human Rights Watch reported that many detainees struggled with the question, who am I now that my life is paused but not finished? When a person cannot define their situation, self-concept becomes unstable. This instability deepens over months, then years. 3. Hypervigilance and uncertainty. Military psychologists noted high levels of hypervigilance, detainees constantly anticipating bad news, punishment, or unexpected changes. Even routine announcements could feel threatening because no one understood the rules of the future. Uncertainty triggers the same neural responses as physical danger. The body stays on alert, draining emotional reserves. 4. Dependency on the detaining authority. With no legal clarity and no defined pathway to release, detainees developed intense psychological dependence on the authorities controlling their fate. Every meeting, every evaluation, every conversation with officials carried enormous emotional weight. One observer described it as hope being rationed. 5. The erosion of hope. Hope is not a luxury, it's a mental survival tool. Documents submitted to courts by the Center for Constitutional Rights highlighted a disturbing pattern. Long-term uncertainty led many detainees to struggle with motivation, sleep, concentration, and emotional regulation. The absence of progress, no trial, no decision, no timeline, slowly dismantled the psychological mechanisms people rely on to endure hardship. It wasn't always visible from the outside, but experts say indefinite detention created an internal pressure that changed how people thought, reacted, and understood their own futures. Guantanamo's greatest psychological impact wasn't caused by walls or guards. It was caused by not knowing when or if anything would change. Legal limbo and mental health. If there is one phrase that defines Guantanamo more than any other, it is this. Legal limbo. Not convicted. Not acquitted. Not awaiting trial in the traditional sense. Just waiting. For years. This legal uncertainty didn't just complicate policy. It had direct, measurable effects on detainees' mental health, documented across reports from the International Committee of the Red Cross, Human Rights Watch, and the Center for Constitutional Rights. 1. The absence of legal closure. In a normal criminal justice system, the process itself provides psychological structure. There are hearings, rulings, motions, and decisions. Even delays still move the case forward. At Guantanamo, many detainees had no charges at all. Attorneys described meeting clients who asked the same question again and again. What am I waiting for? For some, even their lawyers couldn't provide an answer, not because they didn't care, but because no formal timeline existed. With no legal endpoint, detainees became psychologically suspended in the middle of a process that wasn't moving. 2. The impact of military commissions. The introduction of military commissions was intended to create a system for handling cases. But human rights observers found that the rules shifted often. New procedures, new interpretations, new delays. This instability meant detainees couldn't rely on the legal system to orient themselves. One attorney described it as trying to stand on a floor that constantly moves beneath your feet. 3. Unpredictability and mental deterioration. The ICRC noted a strong correlation between legal uncertainty and severe emotional distress. Even individuals with no previous mental health conditions began showing signs of anxiety, withdrawal, or emotional exhaustion over time. Not because of daily routines, but because their situation had no narrative. A mind can handle hardship when it understands the path ahead. Guantanamo offered no such path. For delayed communication and isolation from counsel. Even small delays, postponed meetings, long wait times for legal correspondence, or sudden cancellations had outsized impacts on detainees' mental state. But because each interaction with a lawyer represented a possible answer, a step forward, a sign that the process was moving. When those moments were interrupted, detainees often interpreted it as a setback, even when it wasn't intended to be. Psychologists call this a hope disruption effect. In legal limbo, hope becomes fragile. 5. The emotional weight of not knowing. You don't have to be convicted to feel imprisoned. You just need to feel powerless over your own future. Human Rights Watch reported detainees who described the emotional toll of waiting for decisions that never seemed to arrive, transfers, hearings, reviews, or even simple clarifications. Some said the uncertainty was more difficult than the confinement itself. And over time, this legal vacuum shaped every aspect of mental health inside the facility. It created a psychological pressure that policies alone could not relieve. For many, the real challenge wasn't the walls around them. It was the silence coming from the system that held them. International controversy. From the moment Guantanamo Bay opened, the world watched. And almost immediately, the debate surrounding it grew louder than the facility itself. Guantanamo became more than a detention camp. It became a global symbol, shaping how other nations viewed U.S. counterterrorism policy, human rights commitments, and the boundaries of wartime authority. 1. Global human rights concerns. Organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations Special Rapporteurs repeatedly issued reports expressing deep concern about indefinite detention, transparency, and the psychological conditions documented inside the camp. While they acknowledged the security challenges the U.S. faced after September 11th, these groups questioned whether the methods used at Guantanamo aligned with international human rights standards. Their findings were consistent. Legal uncertainty was causing measurable psychological harm. Detainees had limited avenues for challenging detention. Long-term confinement without trial created ethical and humanitarian dilemmas. 2. Diplomatic tensions with allies. For many U.S. allies, Guantanamo became a diplomatic tightrope. Some countries accepted detainees for resettlement, others criticized the camp publicly while navigating private security cooperation. European governments, in particular, released parliamentary reports and official statements questioning the camp's practices. They argued that the legitimacy of counterterrorism operations depended on transparency and respect for established legal norms. In several cases, governments faced domestic pressure to condemn the camp's indefinite detention policy. This tension affected intelligence partnerships, negotiations, and even public trust in government actions tied to the war on terror. 3. Legal opinions from international courts. While no single international court had full jurisdiction over Guantanamo, legal scholars and human rights tribunals consistently referenced it when discussing detention standards, due process, and state obligations. These opinions didn't change U.S. policy directly, but they influenced the global conversation and shaped how future detention policies were viewed. 4. Media exposure and public opinion. Once journalists gained limited access, news outlets around the world began publishing interviews, photographs, and investigative reports. Public perception shifted as details emerged about the length of detentions, the lack of charges, and the psychological impact documented by medical experts. For many viewers, Guantanamo became a symbol of post-9/11 fear, power, and ethical complexity, a place where national security and human rights collided, with no easy answers. 5. A divided global narrative. Around the world, Guantanamo represented two conflicting ideas. To some, a necessary facility for preventing future terrorist attacks. To others, a human rights failure shaped by secrecy and unlimited detention. And in the center of the controversy were real individuals, detainees, guards, legal teams, and families, living through the consequences of decisions made far beyond the fences of the base. The international debate didn't just challenge policies. It amplified a question still asked today. Can security be protected without sacrificing the principles that define justice? The future of Guantanamo Bay. For more than 20 years, Guantanamo Bay has existed in a space between eras. Born in the urgency of post-9/11 fear, sustained through shifting political climates, and repeatedly examined by courts, Congress, and international observers, yet still operating. The future of the camp is a debate shaped not just by policy, but by psychology, diplomacy, and legacy. 1. A facility caught between promises. Multiple U.S. presidents have announced intentions to close Guantanamo. Yet despite transfers, reviews, and policy reforms, the camp remains open. Because closing Guantanamo requires solving a series of difficult problems. Where can detainees be transferred safely? How should cases with incomplete evidence be handled? What legal system should oversee unresolved charges? How do you dismantle a structure built on laws created specifically for this facility? These questions have no simple answers, and each administration has struggled to resolve them. 2. The shrinking population. From more than 780 detainees, the population has now been reduced to a small fraction of that number. Many have been cleared for transfer yet remain in custody pending diplomatic arrangements. Human rights observers describe this group as the most vulnerable psychologically. Individuals approved for release, yet still waiting because the logistics of relocation remain unresolved. Their situation reveals a stark truth. Even when the legal process moves forward, uncertainty can continue. 3. Legal reforms and review boards. Periodic review boards were created to assess whether detainees still pose a threat or could be transferred. On paper, they provide structure. But for detainees who have waited years between decisions, even structured reviews can feel unpredictable. A favorable assessment does not guarantee immediate release. An unfavorable one may not provide clear reasons. Psychologists point out that this unpredictability continues to produce mental strain, even in the final years of the camp's operation. 4. International pressure for closure. The United Nations and several allied governments maintain that Guantanamo should be closed. Not merely for symbolic reasons, but because indefinite detention is seen as incompatible with international human rights standards. Diplomatic pressure has pushed progress, but slowly. Each transfer requires agreements, monitoring arrangements, security guarantees, and sometimes resettlement programs, a lengthy process that can take years. 5. The psychological legacy. Even if Guantanamo closes tomorrow, experts warn that its psychological impact will last far beyond the final detainee's departure. Indefinite detention taught the world a difficult lesson: that the human mind is deeply shaped by the presence or absence of certainty. The camp's legacy will be measured not only in policies and headlines, but in the long-term mental health journeys of the people who lived inside its walls, detainees and personnel alike. 6. What comes next? The future of Guantanamo Bay is still being debated in government halls, international courts, and diplomatic meetings. But one thing is clear: leaving the camp behind will require more than closing a facility. It will require confronting the ethical, psychological, and legal questions it raised, questions that continue to influence how nations think about security, justice, and human rights. Guantanamo Bay may eventually close, but the conversation it started is far from over. Guantanamo Bay is more than a detention facility. It is a mirror reflecting the delicate balance between national security, human rights, and the fragility of the human mind. Through decades of indefinite detention, the stories of detainees reveal one universal truth: uncertainty can be as punishing as any prison wall. As the world continues to debate Guantanamo's future, the lessons remain clear. Justice is not just about punishment or protection, but about preserving the mental and emotional integrity of every individual, even those deemed the enemy. These are not abstract ideas. They are the lived experiences of hundreds of people whose lives were reshaped, sometimes irreversibly, by a system built on waiting. If you want to explore more documentaries uncovering the hidden realities of detention, justice, and human psychology, hit subscribe now. Turn on notifications so you never miss an inside look at the world's most controversial facilities, and witness the stories that the news rarely tells. Join us, and see what happens when the mind meets indefinite detention.